Hello, welcome to the Making of Madrid, a podcast all about Madrid, hosted by me, Felicity Hughes, a journalist and tour guide. Today's guest is Luke Stegemann, and he's written this amazing book called Madrid, a New Biography, which tells the whole history of Madrid in just one book. It's quite a feat. And critical praise has been very high for this book. So I'll just read a review out from the Wall Street Journal, which said, masterly. Stegmann's strength lies in the way he brings people to life, and Madrid teams not only with kings and their consorts, but also with writers, artists, rebels, and villains. Hi, Luke.
Hi, Felicity. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you doing?
Yeah, really well, really well.
You were in Valencia today, right?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Both suffering slightly from the extreme heat, which is both here in Valencia, I think.
Yeah, certainly. But look, it's okay. It's okay. As I was, I'm used to this sort of heat in summertime, so no problems. Yeah.
Yes, as an Aussie and someone who's lived in Spain for a very long time. How long did you live in Spain?
Look, I lived different periods of time, sort of from the mid to late 80s through to, I guess, about 2008 was the last time I lived here full time. But in that period, probably about 14 or 15 years.
Okay.
But there were periods where I went back to Australia, was overseas, other places, but Spain's kind of been my base, or if you like, the other half of my life, I guess, for 40. It terrifies me to realize it, but it's 40 years now.
And what sparked your intense interest in Madrid in particular and made you want to write this history of the city?
I think, look, when I came as a young man, I came to Spain, which, at the time was considered a very unusual choice for a young Australian. It was very rare to go to Spain or indeed Madrid. And I remember when I first arrived, the first year or two I was in Madrid, it was very, very unusual to meet any Australians. I knew one or two, and that was about it. We were a very, very rare breed. So I came to Spain, and the first years that I spent of my sort of whole experience, if you like, of being in Spain and learning Spanish language and culture and history, began in Madrid. And that was probably a slightly fortuitous the way that turned out, but we don't need to discuss that story. But the point was I was in Madrid, and I guess where everything Spanish for me started off was Madrid. So I always had this desire to, because my years in Madrid were so fruitful and so important in the context of my whole life, that I reached a point probably around 2010 or so where I thought I really wanted to find a way of sort of paying homage, if you like, to the city of Madrid. Now, it took me a while to get round to writing the book. I probably started in about 2015, 2016, and I then got distracted and wrote a completely different book called Amnesia Road, which explores the questions of historic memory and the politics around historic memory in both Australia and Spain, where there's obviously a lot of history to be discussed in both countries. And then when that was out and published 2021, yes, it got delayed a little bit because of COVID, but came out in 2021, and then late 2021, I thought, right, I've got to get back to that idea of the Madrid book. And then it took me 2 solid years of writing and research to do it. And I was, I thought I knew Madrid. I thought I knew Madrid well, and I could draw on a lot of my own experiences, but I was probably not prepared for the amount of information that I uncovered because the history, as you know, is so rich.
Was there anything that surprised you in particular?
That's an interesting question. Probably, I guess probably the extent to which one of the things that surprised me was the extent to which the architecture of Madrid has changed so much over the years. I think there's probably been, I wouldn't say an infinite number, but there's been that Islamic Madrid, there's been that medieval Madrid, there's been that Renaissance, that Baroque, there's been that neoclassical, that 19th century. All those Madrids have sort of come, and to an extent, a lot of them have gone as well. So I think, if you chose any time in history of the last 1,000 years or so, and you visited Madrid, you'd see a quite different city, depending on what time you visited.
Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing about this book is it came out in Spanish before it came out in English. Oh, can you tell me a little bit about why that happened?
That was unusual. Yes. There was a piece about me in El País in was it January, early 2023, and I was probably halfway through writing the book at that stage, and it's interesting. I was just at the time. Let me say in March 2023. I woke up one day for an email from some people at Espasa, and they said, "Hey, we've seen this article. We're really interested in this book of yours, Madrid. Have you sold the Spanish rights?" And I thought, well, actually, I didn't actually have an English language publisher at that point, although I had started negotiations with Yale University Press, so they had expressed interest. And I said, and this is funny, and you'll appreciate the way these things sometimes work, Felicity. I said, okay, well, look, how about I send you a couple of sample chapters? You can have a look. Let me know what you think. And Espasa said, no, that's okay. That's okay. It's all right. Just send us and we'll publish it. And I thought, well, that was very generous. But I said, but look, I haven't finished it yet. And they said, well, how much longer? And I said, no, I'm probably giving myself another a year and a half, 2 years, because I really want to get it really, really well done and finish it off. And they said, okay, look, here's the deal. We want to publish this to coincide with the Madrid Book Fair in summer of 2024. So counting back 2 or 3 months to translate it, months for, editing, marketing and so on. They said, you've got 5 or 6 months to finish it. And I had given myself sort of 18 months to 2 years. And I said, yep, okay. Okay. And then what happened was basically during 2023, I pretty much gave up all my weekends and evenings and mornings, just getting the book finished. It was a real, it was an exciting exercise, but it was a great act of discipline to actually get it written, or finish it off. I mean, as I say, it was half done. Finished off in that short time frame. But so Espasa in Madrid said to me, look, we want to release this in June of 2024 with the Madrid Book Fair. Yale came to me and they said, when they gave me a contract, they said, we're going to release this in the northern fall or autumn of 24, so around September, October. They said, that's when we're releasing. So that's fine. It didn't bother me either way. But as it happened then, the Spanish translation came out before the English language edition, which was unusual.
And I mentioned in the intro to this that you got very good press in the English language press. What was the Spanish reaction?
It was also very good. I've got to say that I don't think that I'm aware of. I don't think there have been any negative reviews. It was written about very positively in El País, in El Confidencial, ABC, El Mundo, I think. And then I was on Onda Cero, La Ser, radio interviews and so on. And everyone was really, really welcoming and open and very, very pleased to discuss the book. So that was really nice. It was good.
Yeah, I've seen it in bookshops all across Madrid now. So it's obviously
that's
gone
great.
down well.
Is that the English language one or the Spanish one?
I've seen both. Yeah.
Right. Good. Oh, fantastic.
Okay.
Yes.
So you had to do loads of work and a lot of reading. And I love that this included literature as well as historical books. So who are your favorite writers on Madrid?
I think one of the great revelations for me, if you like, was as part of I really got in and read a lot of the novels of Galdós, who was an author who I knew of but wasn't really that familiar with, and I wouldn't pretend to have a great familiarity either now, but I did read probably 6 of his novels in Spanish, and someone who's wrote, I think, 75 novels or something, that's probably a small part, but to have read 6 of his novels and I realised, I've always been a fan of, for example, an author like Charles Dickens, who was roughly a contemporary. Oh, no, not quite, but roughly.
Oh yeah, he translated Dickens, I
He
think.
did. He did.
So I think he came slightly after Dickens, so he got to have this huge influence from Dickens.
Yes, that's certainly true. And like Dickens, he started out as a reporter, as doing his journalistic pieces, the way Dickens did his sort of parliamentary reporting in London, and so they both sort of cut their teeth in that style of writing. And when I read Galdós, I thought, yeah, this guy, he's actually really, really, really good. He's, I think, one of the great 19th century novelists. It's a shame he's so little known in the English speaking world, but that's probably just that there aren't good translations of his work really available, apart from Fortunata and Jacinta, but apart from
Yeah,
that.
which is what I'm reading right now.
Oh, it's a wonderful book. It's a wonderful book. Yes, I do.
Yeah.
But it is one of those sort of 19th century door stoppers. Whereas some of his shorter novels, I find you get really, really punchy. Just a couple of 100 pages in, tell the story. There's some great characterizations and portraits of 19th century Madrid and its people. And from the 20th
That's what
century,
I was going to say. Great characterization.
oh,
It
fabulous!
really
Really.
brings Madrid of the past to life.
He really does. He really does. Yeah. And look, 20th century, it'd be difficult to say. There's so many authors. Again, because I wanted to talk about an author who would be known to English language speakers. So Javier Marias, for example, who's a writer I don't like all his books. I think some of them are overly pretentious and hard work and not even particularly interesting, but he does have some really, really great novels as well, like Berta Isla, for example. Los Enamoramientos is set in Madrid that really show a fascinating side, that kind of middle class sort of Chamberí type Madrid in the late 20th century, early 20th. I think Marias portrays that really, really well.
When I was preparing for this interview, I put together questions and then I realized that even though I tried to narrow it down to briefly just mention one period even, they were running really long.
Yes.
But as I'm writing the Madrid guide for Lonely Planet, I had to write an essay, which is Madrid summarized in 6 events. So I thought I would maybe flip the question on you and ask you for 3 events just to kick off, because we've got a huge swathe of history to cover and we won't be able to get into all of it. So tell me about what 3 events do you think defined Madrid?
Yeah, you're right. Like, from so many to choose from, I would go. So, for example, if you like, Reconquest, when Madrid is taken by the forces of Alfonso VI, when he takes Toledo in 1085, and I think it's Madrid in 1086 or so, and of course that's when the apparently miraculous apparition of the Virgin Almudena in the walls. I think that's a really that folklore, but it's fascinating sort of origin story. I think that's a really interesting time in Madrid, because just 20 or so years after, there was still another very serious attack on Madrid by Islamic forces who almost retook the town, I think in 1108, 1109, which is where the famous Campo de Moro has its origins. And so I think there's that period. I think also, look,
maybe we should, for people who don't know about that the Campo de Moro are gardens that not a lot of people discover because they're just beneath the palace but hard to get to. But the geography of Madrid goes back to those fortifications that were built when you're on a sheer drop, which literally the garden kind of drops down. So it was hard. They were kind of unable to take the city because of this barrier, right?
That was one of the main reasons. But then when they were camped out, sort of besieging the city, there was a plague that broke out as well, as happened so often in earlier times, which decimated their forces as well. So I think they were up against. It's interesting because they were besieging what was an Islamic fortress. So it was sort of against. It's a tribute to the strength of their own fortifications, or earlier Muslim leaders, a tribute to the strength of their fortifications that in the early 12th century they couldn't break through, and Madrid remained, unconquered, if you like, as a nominally Christian town at that point. Yes, but you're right. Look, the Campo del Moro, it's such a beautiful garden, and it's, you go there and there's really that many some spectacular views looking back up at the Royal Palace. Some beautiful walks. Yeah, it's one of those, isn't it? I mean, this is not an entire other issue, but or topic, but there's so many lovely places to walk in Madrid. But maybe that's a separate question.
Yeah, but getting back to the Christian conquest, we don't really know, like the date changes depending on what book I'm reading. So I've heard 1083 or 1085, because what is really well documented is the taking of Toledo in 1085. But we're not quite sure how Alfonso took Madrid. And do you have a theory about that?
No, I don't, and I couldn't work out either whether Madrid was taken on the way to Toledo, or having taken Toledo, they then came back and took Madrid. I don't know. I'm not sure we'll ever know, but it's interesting that as a fortification, as a hilltop fortress town, Madrid was there to protect Toledo, really. I mean, that was part of its role, was to, apart from being part of that whole line of defences across central Iberia, that moving dividing line between Islam and Christianity, if you like, that moved backwards and forwards during those centuries. Yes, but that part of Madrid's role was, it was by no means a capital city or even a major medieval town. It was just a hilltop fort, one of whose main roles was to guard the roads to Toledo. So, I guess, Felicity, we won't ever know that. Look, there may be historians that have better evidence, but I didn't find it.
No. Toledo was ripe for a fall, though, really. Had they begun to pay tribute to the Islamic ruler?
Yes. Yes.
Sorry, to the Christian ruler, the Islamic ruler.
No, of course. Yes. Toledo was, look, again, that's something where the politics is so complex. And, I think a lot of people looking at Spanish history tend to think, there's this black and white, there's Islam here, there's Christianity here, but there was so much backwards and forwards between both sides. There were so many people who fought on one side or fought on the other. There were princes on one side or rulers who paid homage to those on the other side, and essentially buying protection. It was enormously complex, the politics of who was on which side. And I think it's, from modern period, it's tempting to just consider, yes, there was this side and there was that side, but it was a complete, going backwards and forwards for centuries, really, certainly around the period of Madrid and Toledo.
A feudal period, right? A small kingdom vying for power.
Yes. Certainly, I mean, specialist medieval historians unweave all that stuff, but I'm not a specialist medieval historian, so I just look at, okay, what are the broad brushstrokes?
Yes.
What do we essentially know here? Yeah.
I think El Cid is a great example of that, because he fought for both sides, right? Whoever paid him the most.
Absolutely he is. Yes. And can I just say, Felicity, because I know, that you write as well on Madrid and with Lonely Planet and so on, and I think, like, my attitude has always been, I think it's important to do all the academic reading to really get to terms with all the serious research on topics such as Madrid, the history of Madrid, or medieval Spain, or whatever it might be. But then I think most people, if you want to sell books to a large number of people, most people want an entertaining story, which doesn't mean you make stuff up. Certainly not. Absolutely. So you've got to be sort of rigorous, but it's fascinating. It's, history should be kind of not fun, but it's so endlessly entertaining what
Mm.
has come before us. And I think I read a lot of wonderful books on Madrid or Spanish history, a lot of academic work, which is absolutely brilliant, but it's kind of not all that interesting because it's so specialized in such small details. You think, well, okay, this is great, but I don't think the general reader, which is who I write for,
Mm.
is really wants that level of nuance. Mm.
Yeah, I think part of the success of your book is that it's in a literary style and very
Yeah.
connected to your love and passion for the city, right?
Mm. Mm. No, that's important for me as well because that's always been the way I write. And I've discussed that with my publisher, with various publishers, and um, there's a famous English Hispanist, quite old now, called Henry Kamen, and really enjoyed many of his works over the years. And he'd always said, the history, it's a matter of you've got to get the facts right, but you've got to you blend the facts with a kind of literary imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's a certain amount of, this is a really interesting topic. I think there's a certain amount of license available to a writer. Can I just mention one very, very brief example?
Mm-hmm.
It's in the book, and it's where you read the history. You say, when it came to the late 15th century, when Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile married, and it mentions briefly, Ferdinand and a couple of his sort of offsiders or bodyguards or whatever, they spent a couple of days riding across Spain from Zaragoza, I think it was, to Valladolid, to marry Isabel. And they had to travel by night, sort of in disguise and so on, because, there was a lot of opposition to that marriage. And that fact is just mentioned. And I think, well, hang on, what a great story that is. This guy who was, be one of the most important medieval kings in Europe in terms of his influence, doing this kind of overnight, over 2 or 3 nights dash across Spain on horseback in disguise. It's the kind of stuff that adventure novels are made of. And
Mm-hmm.
so I wrote a couple of paragraphs, just kind of reimagining or recreating that kind of scene. And I think on the one hand, people would say, well, historically you're having a little bit of a license there, but in the absence of any other information other than he left Zaragoza, he travelled to Valladolid, arrived there 5 days or whatever it was later. And we know he travelled by night in disguise with a couple of sort of henchmen with him. Those facts can't be disputed, but there's the opportunity there to recreate that kind of journey. So that's kind of how a lot of my writing evolves.
Yeah, and as long as you're careful with your language when you say, it might have been like this,
Yes.
it's perfectly fine to do that.
No,
Because
yeah.
I agree, a lot of history writing can be a little dry. So, yeah.
Indeed.
What about your next great moment in the history of
Yes, I
Madrid?
was about to say we've got to get on to the second great moment, don't we? Look, so many to choose from. I would love to be in the Madrid of, let's say, the 1570s, 1580s, when during the construction of El Escorial on the outskirts of Madrid, because not just for what that building represents in terms of Philip II and a sort of an embodiment of Spanish imperial power, but also, I mean, as I mentioned in the book, it's Philip II and El Escorial both have sort of had a bad rap over the years. Mainly it has to be said from British historians. They've never forgiven him for the Spanish Armada, but so he's always had that kind of been quite negatively portrayed. But what was happening at El Escorial was not just the construction of the building, but the way it was filled with the most magnificent art, manuscripts, sculptures, and Philip, with all the resources at his disposal, brought some of the finest sculptors and painters from Italy, from Northern Europe, from Flanders and so on, brought them down to work at El Escorial. And then that whole group of artists had a very strong influence on the following generation of painters, particularly around Madrid and around the court. So when you start going into the early 17th century, there's a lot of people there who had been strongly influenced by all the people who had come from abroad to work at El Escorial and to fill its halls and corridors, with treasures. There's the famous story of El Greco's painting. I think it's the Disrobing of Christ. I think it is that. No, it's the Martyrdom of Saint Bartholomew. I probably got that wrong, but famously, when El Greco was invited to submit a painting to, and Philip II basically looked at it and frowned and said, "No, I don't like. He's too unconventional. I don't like his style. There's too much here which is not doctrinally pure." And so El Greco kind of got the boot, and that's one of the reasons why he was never a court painter in Madrid, and lived out the rest of his days in Toledo and just did his own thing and became the astonishing painter, that he always was. So so Felicity, that period, I guess second half of the 16th century, I think it's a really rich time for art. Of course, you've got the young Cervantes, the young Lope de Vega, these sorts of people who are starting to or trying to make their name. So the whole wave of the golden age drama is about to break on the Madrid theatres. So I think that's a very, very rich time as well. I would love to have.
And we should say this is all predicated on Philip II making the decision to keep the court in Madrid in 1561. And building El Escorial, I suppose, is a big symbol of that, right? That he's the permanence of this decision, possibly.
Yes. Yes. I mean, the famous quote of how his father, Charles V, had said, if you want to expand the empire, make your capital Lisbon. And, the Portuguese might have at times go, hang on, what's going on here? But, of course, from 1580 for the next 60 or so years, Portugal was part of Spain. So the idea of, look, if you want to expand this empire, you need to look out to the Atlantic horizons. And so Lisbon would have been an absolutely magnificent capital. It might have been a capital of the entire Iberian Peninsula. Who knows? And then the other option was Toledo. And then Philip his father, Charles, strongly recommended against not choosing Madrid. But Philip had spent a lot of his childhood in Madrid and he loved the place. And so he opted to to stop the court being an itinerant court, hopping around from, Valladolid, Burgos, Barcelona, Valencia, all over the place, and actually stopping now in Madrid. So it's a very, very fateful decision for Madrid's history, no doubt about it.
And he never told us why, which is really frustrating for historians. But do you have any guesses?
Oh, look, there are dozens of theories about it. One, of course, is that Philip had spent a part of his childhood in Madrid, so he liked it there. The other one is Madrid was at the time surrounded, still to a little bit extent, but not as much as then, surrounded by beautiful forests and hunting. And the Spanish royals, they loved their hunting, So Madrid had that. It was kind of right in the center of the peninsula. Also, the other thing about Toledo not becoming the capital was, and I think a number of historians suggest this, that Toledo was the center of the church in Spain. And so there were some very powerful bishops and papal representatives based in Toledo, and Philip sort of didn't want to have to be dealing with them in terms of making decisions. He wanted to say, okay, no, I'm going to be in charge here, not the church, even though he was an extraordinarily devout Catholic. But in terms of sort of secular earthly power, Philip wanted to be in charge, not be sort of at the beck and call of church leaders. So he wanted to keep away from Toledo for that reason. There are other minor theories about, his wife didn't like the climate in Toledo. Not that it's very different from the climate in Madrid, mind you, but yes. No, but it's an interesting thing. I was discussing this recently with someone else, how, and I mentioned it in the book, of how one of the consequences of that decision to make Madrid the capital rather than Toledo has meant that so much of Toledo has been preserved. And the extraordinary city that Toledo is nowadays, with its mosques and synagogues and churches and its art and its history, if that was the capital of Spain, so much of that stuff would have been knocked down and not preserved, which is what happened in Madrid. Madrid's just constantly being knocked down and rebuilt. So in a sense, Toledo owes its sort of legendary status as a site of cultural tourism nowadays in large part to the fact that it has not been knocked down and destroyed at any point.
In fact, I think that anyone coming to Madrid to visit who's a history buff has to go and see El Escorial and Toledo to understand the city, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. You're right. Very important to understand Madrid. Yes, El Escorial is vital. So is Toledo, and I mean, to a lesser extent, perhaps La Granja, which is sort of out in the northern, and which is just into the province of Segovia as well. One thing that you asked me before about things that surprised me, I was surprised to find in the 13th and 14th centuries that was really a real war going on between Madrid and Segovia for control of the pastoral lands, the hunting territories, the streams, forests, and so on, between Segovia and Madrid. And a large part of that was the property of Segovia, and Madrid eventually sort of bit by bit took it over. And so there was a lot of bad blood between the Segovians and the Madrileños back in the 14th century, which I'd never been aware of that story. It's quite an interesting tale. So yeah, Segovia is also a fantastically interesting place, but certainly if you've got one town, it's got to be Toledo, because it's not just all the architecture, it's the El Greco Museum, it's all of that stuff. So wonderful, so wonderful. And yeah, absolutely, it's integral to the history of Madrid.
And its history goes back much further than Madrid as well, because you've got it all going back to it was the capital of the Visigoth kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula.
Yes, it was a Roman town as well, Toledo. Yeah, very important.
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
A very important Roman town. It was, well, you're right, it was the capital of Visigoths. I mean, and I think they made that their capital because the Romans had already made it an important centre.
And that's the thing that we're missing in Madrid is this any kind of Roman history. You have to go all the way out to Alcalá de Henares to see anything. So
it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a kind of a ring around Madrid of ancient Roman settlements which have been turned up. Obviously, Alcalá de Henares and Titulcia and places like that. But Madrid itself, no. That's sort of really possibly starts with the Visigoths. Possibly a small settlement there, but really begins as an Islamic hilltop settlement. Military settlement. But yeah, so that area around Madrid, which is rich, fertile, looking at it nowadays, it might be hard to imagine, but very rich and fertile back then, and very amenable for Roman settlements.
The other weird thing about Madrid is we have no cathedral, but this is why we have no cathedral, because the Diocese of Toledo was spurned, but we are part of that diocese, so there was no permission granted for so long.
That's right, and that's why it took so long to get the Almudena Cathedral built. And I mean, people will get angry at this, but it is a pretty ugly building as far as cathedrals in Spain go, or religious architecture generally in Spain goes. It's not one of the best. No. I mean, it's very much a later construction, and you can see that.
I don't think people would get angry with you, because I don't know a single Madrileño that likes the Almudena Cathedral. Do you?
Yeah, well, actually, no.
Let's see. Let's move on to another one then. What's your third one?
Ooh, I guess I would probably toss up between two. No. I would probably go for Madrid in the late 1920s, early 1930s. I was just thinking that, should we go for, Madrid of the Napoleonic invasion or the Madrid of the Civil War? But I think let's get away from all the war and let's say, what about a time of peace and just enormous creativity? And, as you know, in the book, I compare 1920s, early 1930s Madrid to Belle Epoque Paris or Weimar Berlin as a place where there's this extraordinary collection of artists and writers and musicians, poets, and people from foreign countries were coming and were just there's just this effervescent cultural life, and that's, I think, would be a fantastically interesting time to visit Madrid. Of course, that all stops with the outbreak of the Civil War. There was an undercurrent of violence through that period as well. We shouldn't idealize that time, but just in terms of the sheer creative output of people living in Madrid at the time, fantastic.
What sort of figures would be mentioned within that movement then?
Well, I mean, most famously, this was where Buñuel, Dali, and Lorca all met at the students' residence. Maruja Mayo, the fabulous 1930s painter. A whole host of others. So many poets who, Juan Ramon Jimenez, poets who later on, many of them went into exile. They were. I mean, Pablo Neruda, who was, not the best of people, but he was in Madrid at the time. So really, I was actually, when I started researching that a little bit, the names started coming. Oh, this person was there. Oh, that person was there. Oh, this person was there, and it just sort of accumulated, and then the student the residencia, under his name Fraud, the director of it, they invited an extraordinary range of people, intellectuals and artists from 1930s Europe, and some from America as well. And we know how many astonishing names there were around at that time, like Stravinsky and so on. So these people coming and visiting and performing or giving conversations and so on.
It's an institution that still exists as well. I visited it on a tour of hidden Madrid gardens once, and they mentioned that the academics still come and stay there.
Yes. It's one of those ones that survived. Yeah.
And then, of course, you get into the Civil War, and I'm thinking about this a lot at the moment because I'm trying to write a piece about why doesn't Madrid have a museum of the Civil War? And I don't know if you have any opinions about that.
Yeah, that's as you well know, any sort of entering into this territory is risky, which is a terrible shame because it shouldn't be. I mean, people should be able to express opinions on this one way or the other without it sort of causing great controversy. But, I mean, some people would say, I wouldn't necessarily agree with them, but some people would say that the Valle de los Caídos is essentially a museum. It's a very macabre and morbid type of museum in the sense that, there are the remains of 30,000 people buried there and so on. I've always thought that place could be reassigned or redesigned, if you like, and that would be a great place to have a museum of the Civil War. But it's so difficult to imagine people coming together in agreement. Can you imagine the arguments that would come about? Is it presenting the war ideologically from this way, or is it presenting it that way? Why are there these exhibits? Why aren't there those exhibits? It would go on and on and on. And I think it's one thing that, I think if there was a greater level of, I don't like to say maturity because that sounds a little bit condescending, but I think if there was a greater level of just understanding and compassion and, I think, you're right. You think, why is there not a fantastic museum of the Civil War in Spain? I mean, God knows there's so much material that you could put in a museum. And it wouldn't necessarily have to be ideological. I mean, you could present the fact that, look, I don't like the cliche of the two Spains, but I mean, you could present it as, look, there were two essentially factions who were supported on the one hand by, the Italians, the Germans, by the Russians, Stalin, and so on and so forth. There's the international brigades, but also all the stories of young people, like men and women, who found themselves caught up in that war when, they had no interest in it whatsoever. But it's one of those times when sort of historical circumstances just catch up with you, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
And people forced into the war, whether it's combatants or defensive roles, nurses, whatever it might be, on one side or the other. And I think there's a tendency to look back and think, well, if you're on that side or on that side, it's as if people made a conscious ideological choice. But so many people didn't. They just, the line, the dividing line between, happened to come down, 5 kilometers from their village, and so therefore you're on that side, and you could either escape across to the other side, or, as most people did, was, look, what do I need to do to survive here?
And surviving was incredibly hard because Madrid was under siege for 2.5 years.
Exactly. Yeah, very, very hard. It was terrible. And certainly the first 6 months, I mean, you had all those years of siege and the bombings. But there was also the first 6 months, there was a lot of Republican violence, the checkers and so on, the summary executions. It's really horrible. I mean.
Oh yes, atrocities were committed on both sides. I was just doing about the Hotel de la Montagne, which is
yes.
up where the Temple of the Bod is now.
That's
and again, there's this plaque there, but it's not very visible. But that was an atrocity on the Republican side because the building was stormed where the army were prevaricating. They didn't know whether to surrender or not, and people were just slaughtered inside.
Yes. Yeah, and that sort of thing was happening all the time. And I think it's interesting. I think it's the absolute cruelty and the fact that it is, within a family, if you like, if we say the family being the Spanish people, that it's kind of brother and sister, and that's sort of part of what has meant that wounds have festered for so long.
Do you see that conversation changing now because that generation is dying out who actually experienced the Civil War?
It's funny that in my book Amnesia Road, which was the one about historical memory in both countries, I posited this theory, which is just a theory I made up, but I think, I think essentially you probably need 100 years to pass, and that way absolutely everybody who might have been involved is dead. And then you're on to not just the next, but the next generation. And I would say, I mean, I cannot imagine that, let's say around 2040 or 2050, that people are still arguing over the Civil War. I mean, they've got to let it go. I say let it go. That's, again, sounds a bit condescending, but at some point there's going to be so many people for whom it just doesn't mean anything. And if you think about the changing demographics in Spain, the extraordinarily high number of immigrants in Spain, for those people, I would say 95% of them would not be remotely interested in the ins and outs of the Civil War because it's something that happened close to 100 years ago. And in the case of immigrants, a lot of them are people who are coming to Spain to look to, develop a new life. They're not wanting to get engaged in political battles or arguments of what happened 100 years ago. So I think, I've got this idea of roughly 100 years, and I think, let's say that would make it to 2039, 2040. I think the decade of the 2040s, I'm sure that by then it's going to have to be all put behind them, I would say. And maybe that's the time to create a really great museum.
I did see there was an exhibition at Filmoteca, which is the National Film Board, and they have a beautiful venue. Do you know Cinedore in Lavapiés?
Yeah, I know it very well. Yes,
Yes.
yes.
A gorgeous, if you're listening, it's a gorgeous 1920 cinema. And then just down the road is a 18th century palace that they also run. And they have exhibitions there. And they did one about Nodo, which is basically a Spanish equivalent of Pathé News.
Yes.
And it was done with a little bit of humor, poking fun at Franco and admitting that a lot of the news was propaganda. But it maintained quite a tone of objectivity. And that's a very difficult thing to do, I think.
I think it is. And it's also, the other thing is that I think there's a tendency to kind of treat Franco's period as kind of 40 unremittingly bleak years of sort of fascist dictatorship. But, it's really, for me, it's a dictatorship in two halves. The first one up to probably the mid-1950s, so the first 17, 18 years. And then from the 1956, when you start having serious student protests in Madrid, and from the 1960s, when Franco sort of hands over running of the economy of the country to a kind of group of technocrats, economists and so on, and they completely changed the idea of, because Franco had this idea of Spain essentially being entirely self-sufficient, which obviously was a complete disaster, and just led to even further poverty and hunger and deprivation. But by the 1960s, there was a certain kind of real increase in living standards, in well-being. I mean, there was a flourishing cinema industry, music, student protests. There was a lot of books that were, in theory, were banned, but were coming into Spain, and music and so on. And it's true that there was still a very repressive military apparatus in place, that death penalty still existed. It was applied a number of times in appalling fashion. There was still a very repressive police. But nevertheless, underneath all of that, there was from the 1960s on, there was a great cultural ferment that was starting to happen. And I think you could say the same, for example, in 1970s, 80s Soviet Russia. Not everyone was living, people were really starting to get ready for change. And I think this is one of the reasons why the famous Movida in Madrid, when it happens, it bursts out so richly, so spontaneously, and so sort of luxuriantly that didn't just come from nowhere. There was a lot of people were getting ready for that kind of moment, had been for 10, 20 years.
Yeah, we should say that the Movida was a cultural flourishing that was in response to newfound freedoms in the transition to democracy. And are you arriving in Madrid too late to catch that, or did you get a little bit of it?
Yeah, I mean, probably the tail end. I mean, it depends on how people define the Movida. Some people say from 78 to 88. Some people are a little bit stricter in terms of how they define it, but certainly by 87, I was living in Madrid, and whether what I was observing at night was the Movida or not, it was just this incredibly intense and frenetic nightlife and cultural activity that was so exciting to be a part of. Look, and also, I mean, this is coinciding. I mean, the mid to late 70s, of course, you're coinciding with the punk explosion in the UK and the punk in New York and all that sort of stuff. And the Spanish, the Movida was a little bit delayed from that, but it drew a lot of its aesthetic features from that. Kind of the look, if you like, the look of the Movida had a lot in common with sort of the late 70s, early 80s in the UK or in New York clubs, that kind of thing. So it was kind of, Spain was like tapping into that kind of cultural moment that was happening in a lot of major Western capitals. It was happening in Sydney and Melbourne, in Australia very much as well. So Madrid was tapping into that. So there were commonalities, in terms of the punk music and the fashion and the style and the kind of art that people were producing. So so it was really exciting to see all that being done through a Spanish lens. And of course, through a lens that was, when I arrived, it was only a decade since the dictatorship had finished, so there was still a real sense of excitement.
And how do you see the future of Madrid?
Gee, that's a difficult question. I think now there's a Spanish demographer whose name escapes me right now, but he wrote a book, I think came out last year, called Madrid DF. And I think he was saying, look, Madrid needs to prepare itself for being a capital of 10 million people. And how is it going to accommodate that? Because Madrid's in this period of enormous growth, and that's going to continue. And he posits, and I think it's interesting, the idea that if you're going to have a city of 10 million people, as you have in the UK or in France or in so many places in South America, if you have a city of 10 million people on the Iberian Peninsula, the only place that really can happen is Madrid. Lisbon won't happen. Lisbon, Bilbao, Seville, Barcelona, Valencia, these won't become cities of 10 million people, whereas Madrid might. And his idea was that Madrid will, in fact, become a city of 10 million people. So I guess the future is, it's going to become a new hybrid. As you know, Madrid is enormous influence of Latin American immigrants and the culture that they bring. And so the nature, if you like, that whole, what's called the Madrid castizo, that kind of native Madrid, if you like, I think that's certainly disappearing. That's the case with many cities around the world. So what Madrid is becoming something completely different. But that's always been the case. Madrid has been this city of enormous evolution and change all the time. So I think, firstly, the real question is, how will Madrid deal with being a city of 10 million people, and will it be able to avoid having, it took a large part of the 20th century to kind of get rid of this ring of terrible slums that had grown up around Madrid, the outskirts, as people in the late 19th, early 20th century came looking for work opportunities, the new sort of industrial wave, and were basically living in terrible conditions without sanitation.
That's where I live. I live in Usera, and this building was built in the 1960s after some slum clearances.
Yes.
So, yeah.
yes. So I think it was in 2005, where one of the last sort of shanty towns was completely demolished and removed. And I think one of the challenges Madrid have will for them not to return. Because Madrid, like so many major cities, has a problem with homelessness, and if Madrid becomes a city of 10 million people, either there's going to have to be some major construction of living, vivienda, the great problem in Spain at the moment. There's going to have to be some serious construction of that, and the question is where, how is that resourced in terms of water supply, and so on. So it's pretty complicated, I think, but it's kind of
so steps are being taken. There's big estates being built to the north and south right now, and that's just as they must connect them up to the city, because who's going to want to live so far out if you're not getting in quickly?
Well, that's true. Having said that, I've always thought that Madrid had a really good transport network, public transport network. I think it functions reasonably well. But you're right. I mean, those estates or those big areas which are growing and growing. It's interesting. I visited one of those back in 2008, might have been 2010, out at a place which name is now escaping me, but it was basically a whole suburb had been built, and the builder was one of these shonky guys who, basically just, Spanish corruption writ large, basically just took off with all this money and left this whole sort of suburb built but abandoned. And I went there, and again at the height of of course the great crisis in 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11 of the building in Spain, and it's now populated and people are living there. But there was a period of time, it was about 5 or 6 years, where it was just this brand new but absolute ghost town, because there was no money to finish the apartments. And
that was the bubble then that they
absolutely, the bubble. Yes. And people didn't have enough money to move in, and they couldn't because technically the apartments weren't finished, so there were security issues, and so on. So it's just this. It was an interesting insight into a period of Spanish history, and also into all this development of Madrid. So much of it, to see these whole vast acres of buildings with no one living in them.
Yeah.
But they are living there now. So yeah, if I see in the next few minutes, if I remember the name of the place, you will have heard of it. Yeah, it's just to
People
the
come
south.
right in.
It's between Toledo and Madrid, and I should remember it because, like I say, I've been there a number of times. But
Well, we could have talked about so much else today, but I think, we don't have enough time, unfortunately. You'll have to come on again.
No.
But to wrap up the show, I always ask people, what's their favorite place in Madrid?
I would say it's difficult to say, but sometimes you tend to gravitate to places which were special to you in your very first years of living in a city. And so the area around the Plaza Mayor, of course, although it's so touristified, if that's a word, touristy nowadays, I got to say that the Retiro Park, but probably my favourite place in Madrid, well, no, definitely my favourite place in Madrid without any doubt, is to be inside the Prado Museum, because that has meant so much to me across the years in terms of understanding art generally, Spanish art in particular, European art, and its role as an institution since the early 19th century in Spain. And it was a place where in my early years in Madrid, typically on Sundays, where I had my residence card, and with that card you could go into the Prado for free on Sundays. And I would often spend a Sunday afternoon or down at the Prado, and, difficult to imagine this now, but often it was kind of half empty. There was just not many people there at all. And you could just wander around through the galleries, and I fell in love particularly with José de Ribera, the great Valencian artist who spent his career in Naples. And I know it's typical, people know Velázquez and Goya and El Greco. They're all fantastic, but Ribera was the one who really, really struck me. So, yeah, I would say...
Well, yeah, interesting you say that, because when I was redoing my Prado content, I really looked into him, and he was the one who influenced Zurbarán and Velázquez with this tenebrist, light, dark style, and he's got some smashing paintings in the Prado.
Oh, he really... Well, he was very much the disciple of Caravaggio. And so it was through Ribera that Caravaggist, whatever the exact adjective is, a style entered Spain. Yeah, no, he was really fabulous. And Ribera is one of the only Spanish painters who... it's interesting. There's a long tradition of course, in Italy, of considering all Italian painters superior to Spanish painters. They have that kind of look down a little bit. The Spanish painters had to learn from us. That kind of attitude, slightly chauvinistic attitude. There haven't been that many Spanish painters who, in their lifetimes, have been considered the equal to their Italian contemporaries. But Ribera was certainly one of them.
Mm-hmm. And final question, what is your favorite Spanish word?
Do you know, there's a word which I learned, I think, in my very first year in Spain, and it's a word which translates as slowly or gradually, and the word is paulatinamente. And I've always loved this word that starts off with Paul, like Paul, and then it's got Paul, and it's got Latin, and it's got the mente. What a fascinating word that is, and I love the sound of it, paulatinamente. I've always really loved that word. So I put that down. Look, there are many others I could have mentioned, Felicity, but I thought, look, why not? That's been my favourite for a long, long time, so I'll stick with paulatinamente.
And even in Madrid, which is the capital, it still has... Spaniards still take things slowly, right?
Yes. Well, for all that, my love of Spain and my love of its culture, I do, I was going to say tear my hair out, but obviously that's not appropriate. But, whenever I have to deal with anything bureaucratic, administrative, I just think, and that's also because Australia where things are done really well and really fast. And I just think it's not that you couldn't do it. It's just that you choose not to. You choose not to be efficient because there are plenty of places in the world that are perfectly efficient. It can be done. Certainly with AI. So nowadays, I had to get a, sorry, I know we're running out of time, but just very briefly, I had to get a document from the Australian government recently, and you apply it online and then some AI system generates a PDF of the document you've requested and sends it to your inbox. I got it in 7 minutes. And, when you apply for things, you wait 3 to 6 months for somebody at a desk to get around to stamping the thing. And you realize, stuff can be done really, really quickly and efficiently for citizens. Yes, but anyway, I shouldn't end our wonderful conversation with a gripe, should I?
Everyone who lives in Spain has the same complaint.
That's true.
But we won't get into that because, like the Bourbons, it's a topic that could just explode and go on forever.
Something else for another time.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you very much for coming.
No, thank you, Felicity. Thank you very much for your interest, and it's been a real pleasure talking with you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye-bye now.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed Luke's interview. I know I did. And if you're interested about the history of Madrid, there's lots more information on my website, themakingofmadrid.com. And if you'd like to support the podcast, you could buy a book of Hidden Madrid over on my website, or you could buy one of my audio tours or simply leave me a tip. But always what's really, really useful is if you leave me a nice review, if you're enjoying the podcast, and a comment even. I love to hear from listeners. Anyway, thank you so much for watching if you're on YouTube or listening if you're on any other platform. Bye-bye.